Hello, everybody. Praying everybody's having a great day, and I'm glad you've taken the time to join us for this week's lesson as we continue with our study on the miracles of Jesus. Tonight, we will begin looking at the account recorded for us in Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. Now, here on Wednesday nights at the Cloudcroft Church of Christ in our auditorium class, we have been going through the miracles of Jesus as recorded for us in the Gospel. So far in that study, we have looked at three accounts where Jesus cast out demons. We've looked at three accounts of Jesus raising someone from the dead. We've looked at the miracle of Jesus healing the woman with the condition of bleeding. We've looked at one miracle of healing the blind. We've looked at one miracle of healing the deaf. And tonight we will begin a look at one of the miracles where Jesus turned a small amount of food into enough food to feed a very large crowd. On more than one occasion, we're told that Jesus fed a multitude of people with just a few fish and a few loaves of bread. The most popular of these miracles is recorded in all four gospel accounts: Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9, and John 6. In this particular miracle, which we're told occurred in Bethsaida, Luke 9 and verse 10, Jesus feeds over 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Everyone ate and was satisfied, and there were 12 basketfuls of leftovers. This miracle was also accompanied by Jesus performing many miracles, healing many. On another occasion, Jesus fed 4,000. This miracle is recorded in Mark 8, 1 through 10, and Matthew 15, 32 through 39. And this is a separate miracle. And it's important to see that this is not just a retelling of the feeding of the 5,000. There are many differences distinguishing this from the other miracle. Different numbers of those being fed, different locations. One occurred on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, the other on the eastern shore. These miracles occurred at different times of the year, indicated by no mention of grass in the second account. A different supply of food at the beginning of the miracle, different number of baskets holding the leftovers, and even a different word for baskets in the second account. Different period of time of waiting for the people. This is the miracle we will be studying, Mark 15 and Mark chapter 8. We'll look at both accounts, but the primary text we will be focusing on is Mark's account, found in Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. And it is a third of a series of stories about bread and the proper place of ceremonial cleanness. In Mark 7, verses 1 through 5, the Pharisees condemned Jesus' disciples for eating bread with unclean hands. Then in Mark 7, 24 through 30, a Syrophoenician woman, a Gentile, boldly requests the metaphoric crumbs of God's provision. And now here in Mark 8, 1 through 10, Jesus feeds bread to a great crowd of Gentiles and Jews. And later in Mark 8, 14 through 21, Jesus will equate the insidious false teachings of the Pharisees with the leaven used in bread. But let's begin tonight by just reading through the text and drawing out some facts. So if you got your Bibles, I'm not going to put the whole text on the slide. I'm going to put the passage, and you can actually grab a physical Bible and open it up to Mark chapter 8. And I'm just going to read to you. You can follow along in whatever translation you prefer. I have in front of me a copy of the 1984 NIV translation. I believe this is an 84 NIV. I'm going to double check that because I'm not crunched for time on these YouTube videos. I can take as long as I want. And while I'm looking for the year on this particular version of the Bible, I would encourage you to hit the like button. It doesn't cost you anything. It does not make me anything. Hit the subscribe button. Also costs you nothing, makes me nothing. What it does do is it gets at those algorithms and helps to get more biblically based truth out there to the world. This is a 1984 NIV. It's the one I grew up on. And it is the account I will be reading the entire passage from. In Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10, Jesus feeds the 4,000. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present. And having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. That's Mark 8, 1 through 10 from the NIV. Now, I will tell you that once we get through studying this particular miracle, we will move into the next passage that talks about the yeast of the Pharisees, because that's applicable. It all ties together with this miracle. And a lot of the lessons we get aren't the actual miracles themselves, but the deeper spiritual meanings behind the miracles and the aftermath of those miracles. We saw that in our study of John chapter 9. But let's just engage the text for a minute. No deep dives here. Let's just look at what it actually says. It says, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Large crowds gathered. Why? Because Jesus is going around the country performing miracles. He's going all through the region of Galilee, north, south, east, and west. He's on the western shore. He's on the eastern shore. He's in predominantly Jewish regions. He's in predominantly Gentile regions, and he is performing a great deal of miracles. And the more miracles he performs, the more people start following along. It says that Jesus called his disciples. Normally in Mark's gospel, when Mark is referring to the 12, he's very specific in that. The fact that he phrases this as just his disciples implies that there's probably more than just the 12 coming along with Jesus. Look at verse 2. What does it say that Jesus has for these people who have been there? First off, how long have they been there? They've been there, according to verse 2, for 3 days. And what did they not have in those 3 days? They had nothing to eat. You know, we got a couple of people in the congregation that give me a hard time every now and then for going over my allotted time at the sermon. You know, I try to get done. Our worship starts at 11. I try to be done. The sermon's the last thing, and I try to make sure we're out of here by 12 o'clock. But you know what? Sometimes I go over. Could you imagine me preaching for 3 days? Well, they'd been there for 3 days and had nothing to eat. And Jesus had what? He had compassion. We are to follow his example. I think a lot of times we get so caught up in arguments about things that ultimately don't matter. We get so caught up in the minor and we forget to major in the major. A lot of times we forget to just have compassion on people. But it says here in verse 2 that Jesus had compassion. And followers of Christ, Christians, a true genuine Christian is going to be someone that has a compassionate heart towards others. And notice how Jesus is fully human. We know the deity of Jesus, but we also need to understand the humanity of Jesus. And Jesus has self-awareness. He recognizes the situation. He can see beyond his own nose, something that a lot of us today have trouble with. He says, if I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. So he is thinking of others. He is thinking about the needs of others. He's living out that scripture from Philippians chapter 2. Let's go to that real quick. We're just kind of freelancing the first part of this class because there's no way I'm going to get through this whole lesson on Wednesday night. So I don't want to record the whole lesson today. So we're just going to kind of freelance and have some fun with today's lesson. But if you turn over to the book of Philippians, which comes after the book of Ephesians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. There it is. Look at Philippians chapter 2, talking about Jesus having compassion here in Mark 8, talking about Jesus recognizing that these people, if they left hungry, not focused on him, focused on the crowd, if they go away hungry, they may collapse along their way, even recognizing that some of them have come from a very long distance to hear him speak. Listen to what he says in Philippians 2. And of course, Jesus is fully human. He's also fully God. All scripture is God inspired. So Jesus wrote the word. He inspired other men to do it. He says here in Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. That's what Jesus does here in Mark 8. Consider others better than yourselves. Each of you, Philippians 2:4, each of you should look not only to your own interest, but also to the interest of others. And then verse 5 begins by saying your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. Well, what's the attitude of Christ Jesus in Mark chapter 8? He has compassion upon those people. He realizes you've been here 3 days. Some of you have traveled a long way. We need to get you something to eat. And in a typical response of his disciples, who, by the way, have just witnessed him feeding 5,000 in a previous miracle, answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed these people? How quickly they forget. And that's true. There's a principle in that for us, okay? We just talked about there's a separate account. There's another miracle that took place where Jesus fed more people than this with the same amount of food, roughly. And yet there were 12 basketfuls of leftovers, yet now the disciples don't seem to remember that. You know, that's how we are. You remember back at 9/11, those of you that are old enough to remember 9/11? And I'm not going to get into all the conspiracy theories surrounding that. I'm just going to say, do you remember 9/11? And you remember how the country came together and how so many people found God during the time of 9/11? How long did it take for those people to fall away? How long did it take for those people to forget? Not very long. We have very short memories when it comes to God's provision. God can see us through a very difficult stretch of our lives, a very difficult time, but most of us, as soon as we get back on our feet and things are going good, we tend to forget about it. And we see that even with Jesus's disciples. But Jesus doesn't get mad at them, at least not that we know. He simply does what? He asks them a question. What is Jesus so often doing in his ministry? He is asking, not telling. Asking makes the other person think critically. We would do so much better in the Lord's church if we did more asking and less telling, forcing other people to come to the conclusion, forcing other people to think. He asked his disciples in verse 5, how many loaves do you have? He doesn't say, you idiots, have you forgotten what I just did? You idiots, you've seen my miracles. Do you not think I can get this? Do you not think I can? He doesn't reprimand him. He doesn't scold him, at least not as far as we know from the text. He simply says, hey, how many loaves do you have? They reply, 7. Let's go back real quick. Go back to Mark 6, just 2 chapters prior to this. Beginning in verse 30 of Mark 6, it says Jesus feeds the 5,000. Let's read this miracle real quick. Again, this is a freelance lesson because I know I'm not going to get through the whole thing in class, so we got 2 weeks to do it. So let's read through Mark 6 real quick. Jesus feeds the 5,000. This is recorded, by the way, in all 4 Gospels, but since we're closest to it, we'll read Mark's account. It says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of him. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, what did he have? He had compassion. He had compassion in Mark 6. He has compassion in Mark 8. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. In Mark 6, he has compassion on them, not so much for their physical hunger at this point in the story, but because of their spiritual hunger. So he began to teach them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. Look at Mark 6. I don't have any slides for this because I'm freelancing. I apologize. We're not in Mark 8 right now. We're back in Mark 6. So these people are hungry in Mark 6, and the disciples say, hey, send them away so they can go get themselves something to eat. Jesus answers in verse 37, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, that would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? And what does Jesus do in verse 38? Ask them a question. How many loaves do you have? He asked. Go and see. Doesn't get on to them. Sorry, I needed another sip of coffee. It's rainy and kind of cool up here in Cloudcroft today. Good coffee drinking weather. Ask them a question again. And I want to go back. Let's jump up back here to Mark 6:37. If you're following along in this very unorganized freelance lesson. Look at verse 36. Let me find verse 36. The disciples tell Jesus to send the people away so they can go and buy themselves something to eat. Now that's a typical Republican, conservative, West Texas response. And I have nothing against Republicans. I've never voted Democrat. I vote for Trump. I'm very conservative. I understand all that. But look at what they're doing. And look at what so many people do today. I'm all for self-sufficiency. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Work hard and live right. Those are things I grew up learning, being taught, things I try to teach my own kids. But let's look at this. How often do we try to put the burden on somebody else so we don't have to mess with it? You know, I had a guy one time that I was ministering to in another town, down in El Paso, as a matter of fact. He was a WBS student that had clicked onto our account online, and I had started studying with him online, got to know him a little bit. And the poor man was in a wheelchair, and he was trying to find a church home, and we helped him find himself a church home there in El Paso. I'm not going to say the name of the congregation. But the man had no transportation. He's in a wheelchair. He had to take public transportation to get to and from the church service. He had to use his money to do that, use change to do that, to get to and from the church service. And he ended up not staying at that congregation. And one of the reasons that he didn't stay at that congregation is because at no time did anyone in that congregation ever offer to pick him up or take him home from services. They asked him how he got to and from services, and his reply was, "Well, I have to take the public transportation," but nobody offered him. That's not a shame, that's a sin. And I commented to that man, if you attended our congregation here, that wouldn't even be an issue. We would have people falling hand over foot to try to take you to service and bring you home. God's people are called to take care of their own, not to depend on other people to do it. Now, that doesn't mean if somebody is able that they shouldn't supply for their own needs. The Bible teaches that. They certainly should. You don't want to enable laziness. The Bible's very clear on that. But in this situation, you see the mindset of Jesus versus the mindset of his disciples. You see Jesus with the spiritual thinking, the disciples seeing everything in a worldly perspective in Mark chapter 6. Send them away so they can take care of themselves. And then Jesus answers in verse 37, no, you help them. All of this is also part of his training of these young men. These are young men that he's training. His apostles, those 12 apostles, these were young men that he is teaching, that he is coaching, that he is building up so that they can become the leaders of the first century church. Of course, they respond, it would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? How many loaves do you have? Again, he asked the same question. So let's get out of Mark 6, because we're not studying that account. We're studying the next account in Mark chapter 8, and we got off track, but that's okay. This is a freelance lesson here. So back to our text in Mark 8, 1 through 10, Jesus feeds the 4,000, which I do have up there on the slide. Trying to go through the text and see what we can learn. We see that Jesus has compassion. We see that Jesus deals with his disciples who he is trying to teach. And you teach by asking questions. You teach by asking, not telling. You sell by asking, not telling. You teach by asking, not telling. The disciples reply 7. Then, after asking, Jesus tells. He says he told the crowd to sit down on the ground where he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks. He broke them and then gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they did so. We're told in verse 7 they only had how many small fish? Just a few. Doesn't give us a specific number, not in the NIV it doesn't. But he gave thanks for them. He told the disciples, hey, go distribute the fish. Verse 8 says the people ate and were satisfied. And afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So, you compare those two accounts, they didn't pick up as many leftovers in this account as they did in the previous account. They fed less people in this account than they did in the previous account, so that implies that the people here were probably hungrier and had greater appetites, probably because they've been there 3 days instead of 1. That has nothing to do with the spirituality of this. It's just an observation. It says in verse 9 about 4,000 men were present. So that's not counting women and children. So it would have been over 4,000 just like it was in the previous miracle. After that, he sends them away, got into the boat with his disciples, and went to the region of Dalmanutha. We're going to look in depth at all these verses and all these different things, but we can see just from drawing some stuff out of the text that large crowds were following Jesus. They had followed him. They had listened to him for 3 days. They didn't have anything to eat. Jesus thinking outside of himself, thinking to the needs of others, living out what the Bible says in Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, had compassion on those people, recognized their need, recognized their problem, asked his disciples to help, and then he took care of the situation. So a lot of stuff there. We could talk all day just playing around with the text. It's kind of like a musician with a guitar. You just kind of jamming. You're just kind of picking and grinning like they used to do on Hee Haw. That's what we're doing in today's lesson. Just kind of casually working our way through it. And then we're going to dig down and get a much tighter lesson in the next lesson. The parallel to this account is found in Matthew 15. And I want you to turn now to Matthew chapter 15. We've read through Mark 8, 1 through 10. Now, let's read through the account in Matthew of this very same miracle. Matthew 15, 29 through 38. Now remember, this is not the feeding of the 5,000. That is a different event. The account in Matthew 15 is the parallel to what we just read in Mark chapter 8. So Matthew 15, beginning in verse 29, Jesus feeds the 4,000. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was 4,000, besides women and children. After Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into the boat and went to the vicinity of Magadan. That's Matthew's account of the exact same story in Mark 8, 1 through 10. So let's focus. Let's compare and contrast. What are some of the similarities? Well, both say it was 4,000 men. Both say they had 7 basketfuls left over. Both give the same number of fish and bread. Both say that Jesus had compassion. Both say that the people were hungry. They'd been there 3 days. What's different about Matthew's account? Matthew's account has more detail. Matthew's account includes details that preceded Jesus feeding the 4,000, particularly in verses 29 through 31. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. So Matthew's account offers a bit more detail of the events immediately preceding this miracle than Mark's account does. And since this whole study is on the miracles of Jesus, Matthew's account, especially these 3 verses, is very relevant to that study, because the feeding of the 4,000 was preceded by a mass miracle event. A mass miracle event. Matthew 15, 29 through 31 follows Jesus and the disciples back to the Sea of Galilee, this time to the southeastern side near the Decapolis, which was a mostly Gentile region. Most commentators believe this marks a unique period in the ministry of Jesus when he did his healing in the predominantly Gentile region of Galilee, especially when you correlate that back with the miracle of Jesus healing the deaf man in Mark 7, 31 through 37. We see that this happened on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, a region known as the Decapolis, 10 cities. These people that were healed were probably mostly Gentiles. Jesus positions himself on a mountain, and crowds come with sick and afflicted people. Jesus heals them, and then the people glorify God. Specifically, they glorify the God of Israel. This adds context to the prior passage, which depicted his encounter with a Gentile woman begging for healing. That conversation and this healing work seem to be ways in which Jesus prepares his followers to spread the gospel beyond the nation of Israel. As Jesus healed and provided for this mixed or predominantly Gentile multitude, it showed that the Gentiles, in fact, were getting more than just the few crumbs from the table that is referenced in Mark 7 and verse 28. Matthew says they laid the people down at Jesus' feet and he healed them. In this incident, we read nothing about any faith on the part of those who were healed, except for the fact that they came to Jesus for help, or they were brought to Jesus for help. But these folks glorified the God of Israel. Even in something as potentially self-promoting as a ministry of healing, Jesus always drew attention back to God the Father, the God of Israel. And this multitude, most likely predominantly Gentile, learned to praise the God of Israel. So that gets us to Matthew 15 and verse 30. From the New American Standard, it says, "And large crowds came to him, bringing with them those who were limping, had impaired limbs, were blind, or were unable to speak, and many others. And they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them." Now, we talked about this in previous lessons. Two miracles distinctive to the Messiah, two miracles that nobody else had ever performed in the past, were the healing of the blind, the deaf, and the mute. I'm putting deaf and mute together into one miracle there. We see that here in Matthew 15:30, definite sign of the Messiah. Jesus had told the Canaanite woman with the demon-possessed daughter that he had been sent to Israel and not to the Gentiles. That's in Matthew 15:24 through 26. And yet, he went ahead and healed her daughter, according to Matthew 15:27 and 28. In the context of this event, the Canaanite woman's encounter looks even more like a teaching moment for the sake of Jesus' disciples. And never forget that. Throughout all of this, he's primarily trying to teach his disciples. In fact, the same Christ who referred to bread and crumbs when speaking to the Canaanite woman will soon provide miraculous food for this predominantly Gentile population, echoing his miracle on behalf of the people of Israel. Matthew 14:13 through 21, when which he fed 5,000 plus who were predominantly Jews, because that took place on the Jewish side, on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Matthew 15:31 from the New King James says, "So the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel." So Jesus is healing these Gentiles without any of the reservations he expressed to the Canaanite woman in the previous section. That makes it even more likely that his interaction with her was a deliberate teaching moment for the disciples. What Israel has mostly ignored, the Gentile world will come to embrace. And Paul, inspired by God, talks a lot about that in Romans 9:30 through 33. In fact, Jesus seems eager to provoke these Gentiles into glorifying the God of Israel. And that brings us to the specific miracle recorded in Mark 8:1 through 10, and in Matthew 15:32 through 38. And we will start there in next week's lesson. In the meantime, I thank you for joining us for today's lesson. I know it was a little disjointed. I didn't have as much stuff up on the slides, and I asked you to kind of just follow along in your own Bible, but that's good. That's how you learn to navigate the scriptures, and we need to learn how to navigate a handheld, physical, tangible, paper-paged Bible. We get too caught up in this digital stuff. We need to learn how to do. You may not always have that digital stuff. Okay, what if technology screws up? What if the power goes out? You need to be able to pick up an actual Bible and thumb your way through the pages and know how to navigate that if you want to have credibility with non-believers, if you want to be able to teach others. So hopefully you got a little practice doing that today. I'm glad you took time to join us for today's lesson. I pray that it challenged you. I pray that it encouraged you. I pray that you'll take the time as you find the time to dig deeper into the scriptures we looked at today. Go ahead and read through this a bunch of times, and next week we'll dive into the text. Beginning, let me see in my notes here where we're going to begin next week. Next week, we're going to begin in Mark chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. In the meantime, I'm praying everybody has a blessed week. Take care. God bless.